Hey folks, Matt Easton here, scholagladiatoria. So you all know that I like a good axe, and one of my favourite axes that I have, in fact I have a pair of these, one made with essentially pattern welded steel and the other one made with mono steel, but they're both from Thor at Thor's Forge. And you remember, well, certainly regular viewers or people who've been watching the channel for a while, many years ago I was lamenting the fact of how hard it is to get hold of a Dane axe that has this reinforced edge and a very thin blade and is basically a pretty light and nimble weapon despite their apparent large size. And I put the challenge out there, I suppose, to if there were any makers out there who thought they could make a Dane axe that actually, you know, was the same proportions and handled in the way that the originals did, to get in contact. And the person who did get in contact, in fact a few people did, but the person who I decided to go with was Thor in Sweden at Thor's Forge. And essentially, he churned out two axes for me that were so good. I did a bunch of things with them. I'm sure I'll do more with them in the future as well, cutting and waving them around and talking about housecarls and all sorts of things. And they've been fantastic things. Two of the nicest replica weapons that I have ever purchased from anywhere of any type. So I'm very, very happy with them. And in fact, Thor has gone on to be pretty much one of the preeminent makers of Dane axes. I think it's kind of nice in a way that he's in Sweden as well, because these, in their time, they weren't known as Dane axes, they were known as great axes, if anything, large two-handed axes. But they are the type that we see on the Bayeux Tapestry, but they were particularly popular in the 10th and 11th centuries. A similar type of axe probably used by the Varangian Guard in the Byzantine Empire as well, who were obviously mercenaries. They weren't incidentally all Vikings, some of them were essentially Anglo-Saxons or English who left England after the Norman conquest as well. But there was this tradition of housecarls that came from Canute's reign, essentially. So Canute and the successive Danish kings in England left behind these housecarls. Now, did housecarls always use these axes? We don't actually know. It's quite possible that only some housecarls used these types of axes and some housecarls had the more usual spear and shield. But anyway, that's conjecture. We don't have a lot of source material to go on. But Thor doesn't only make these axes, despite the fact he's become famous for them and has been churning out Dane axes or great axes by the dozen or by the score ever since. He's become pretty much one of the mainstays of his business, I believe, which is fantastic, and all power to Thor. He deserves all the success that he has got for making these, because he makes lovely, lovely axes. But he does make other things as well. Thor also makes axes, swords, other types of axes, and he's expanding his know-how and expanding his repertoire. And he has sent me another thing to look at, and it's in this box. So let me get this box open. It requires a screwdriver. Let me get this box open and let's have a little look at what's inside. So I've got the box open. Thor certainly packs things well. I don't think I've ever received anything as securely packed as this object was, with about 20 screws with a very solid wooden box. Anyway, better that than the alternative of, you'll see this in a second, this coming through the side of a normal cardboard box or something like that. You clearly have to make this sort of thing secure. So here it is. What is it? Well, it's a battle axe, isn't it? It's a type of fighting axe, essentially probably 14th century. So Thor found the original of this in I believe a Swedish museum. There's not an awful lot of information about it, apart from the fact that it's associated, I believe, with 14th century archaeological findings. So essentially, yes, that would, my appraisal of that would be yes, that is correct. In stylistically speaking, this is a 14th century single-handed axe. Now, sometimes you might see axes like this referred to as horseman's axes, and indeed, of course, unlike the big Dane axe, this is the sort of thing that you could be riding on a horse, a bit like Robert the Bruce, for example, at the Battle of Bannockburn, and this is the sort of axe that you could use from horseback. And But additionally, you could use it on foot. And if we look at the famous Holcomb Bible, the Holcomb Picture Bible, which is an English source from the 14th century, we do indeed see axes rather similar to this being used on foot as well. Because, you know, if that's your hand weapon, that's your hand weapon. And anyone could use this type of axe. It doesn't need to be a knightly weapon, although it could be. If you're fighting in a mixture of plate and mail, so, you know, coat of plates and maybe a bassinet or a great helm or whatever, then indeed this is a very, very useful weapon for that type of fighting. You could argue, and I would argue in fact, more useful than most types of sword of the period. Obviously, usually this would be used with some type of shield. In the Holcomb Bible, we see it used with bucklers, but they can obviously and were used with heater shields, so-called heater shields or knightly shields as well, or any other type of shield really. So usually this is a weapon of offense. Yes, of course you could defend yourself with it. You could stick it in the way of attacks if they're coming in. But predominantly you're going to be using it with a shield or a buckler, and the shield is going to be doing most of the defensive stuff while the axe is doing most of the offensive stuff. Now, what makes this 14th century in style? Well, the general shape of it, but the fact that it has a very prominent spike on the back that you will notice is similar to warhammers. So essentially, this is sort of the beginning of the poleaxe, okay? This is an anti-armour weapon. And yes, of course, you can hit someone who's not wearing armour with it and it will kill them. But this is a specialised, or starting to be, a specialised weapon for overcoming the armour of the day. You could even argue that technologically speaking, within its historical context, that spike, although it's less visually impacting and less visually noticeable to most people, that spike is perhaps more important than that axe blade. Why have both? Well, of course, it gives you options. One of the advantages, of course, of a spike is it's more likely to go through armour, such as mail or indeed even plate. So even smashing that into someone's helmet might go through the helmet. Even if they've got a coat of plates, if you smash them in the chest, it might go through the through part of the coat of plates or their armour or whatever they're wearing. Mail armour, commonly known as chainmail, of course, very vulnerable to this sort of square section spike. But why have an axe as well? Well, quite simply, the disadvantage of a spike is it gets stuck in things. So you that's what you want from a spike. You want it to get stuck in something, but you then have to get it back out again. Well, one of the advantages of an axe is if you're laying about you and hitting things, then you can smash them, cut them, glance off them, but your weapon is still free to move. Now, one thing you have to notice, of course, if you're striking with an axe blade and you've got that sticking out the back, or indeed vice versa, is you've got to be very, very careful that you don't hit one of your mates or indeed yourself on a backswing. Okay, so you have to be aware of the fact that you have two projections from this object that you're using. And that does, of course, mean you need to be somewhat aware of that. Certainly if you're not wearing armour or not wearing a helmet, perhaps, you need to be very, very wary of that, because if that's swinging back towards you, you don't want to lodge that in your own body. That would be somewhat embarrassing and counterproductive, shall we say. So these weapons were used by people on foot, by people on horse, they were used by knights, they were used also by common soldiers, infantry. They were sometimes used by people like archers. We know at like the Battle of Crécy, for example, the archers are mentioned as having hatchets. This would class as a hatchet. Linguistically speaking, these were called axes in English, and they probably would have been called adza maybe in Italy, or atcha, and in France they would be called hache, which gives us the word hatchet. Incidentally, hatchet just means small hache, means small axe. So they were used all over Europe. These types of axes particularly as well were used right the way in Eastern Europe. They're also used by the Ottomans. This is a very common basic design of battle axe, in that you've got a crescent blade on one side and a spike on the other. And in fact, even in 19th century India, we still see axes like this being used. Why didn't these spikes appear a little bit earlier? I don't really know. I mean, I would say the 13th century is when we start to see a sudden expansion of the weapons we see in art and on the battlefield and archaeologically. The birth of the halberd, for example, the birth of these sorts of battle axes with projections on the back, whereas earlier axes just had an axe blade for the most part. But sometimes you get, in the 13th century, you start to get hammer or spike or other sorts of things on the back. And indeed you start to get top spikes as well, but that's more of a 14th and then into the 15th century thing. So has Tord done a good job? Well, obviously I haven't seen the original, but there's some very nice, first of all, it feels good in the hand. It's got heft to it. It feels pretty much similar to most of the other axes or warhammers or maces I own. It's not nimble, but you don't necessarily need or want it to be. You want it to strike with a lot of force. It's not overly heavy, it's nimble enough, but it's nevertheless got quite a lot of authority to it. The spike's very nicely formed, incidentally. I don't know if you'll be able to see this on camera. Let's try and get it to focus. But you'll notice, let's try and focus on the spike. Come on, camera, there we go. You'll notice that this spike is square section. It really wants to focus on my face. But it is slimmer here. Can you see that? So there is actually some kind of weight saving, shall we say. And now I'm a big fan of weight saving. I think weapons, for the most part, should be as light as they can be while still being able to do their job. So you don't want them to be too light, but if you can make this axe still hit with a lot of power, still hit with a lot of authority, still penetrate with that spike, but still be as light and nimble as possible, that's a good thing. So some weight saving here, very, very nice. It means that the point as well is not too slender, it's very beefy and square. It's less likely to bend or break or anything like that. If you're smashing it into armour or helmets or into mail and then trying to lever it back out again, or indeed getting stuck in a shield, that kind of stuff. And the axe blade, you'll notice, is not overly big, but it doesn't need to be. It's as big as a battle axe, a one-handed battle axe needs to be to get the job done. It's not huge, it's not a huge great crescent blade. If it was, to make it lighter, it would need to be very thin. This is actually a very, very strong, robust axe. And in fact, if you look at most poleaxes of the 15th century, most poleaxe heads aren't actually very big, despite the fact they're two-handed weapons. They're not as big as a Dane axe. And that is because, of course, the Dane axe, for the most part, is hitting lighter armoured targets. So you can have a very thin blade with the Dane axe. When you get into the 14th and 15th century, where the majority of soldiers on the battlefield are wearing some degree of armour, and some of the soldiers on the battlefield, knights, men-at-arms, are wearing a lot of heavy armour, the heaviest really that we've seen in history. You need blades to be robust and strong so they won't get chipped and bent and broken in use. So there we go, lovely another axe from Tord. Well done, Tord, I love it. Very, very nice. This is exactly the sort of thing that I picture Robert the Bruce using at Bannockburn. And I can't remember the knight, was it de Bohun? I can't remember the name of his opponent, but he basically felled his opponent with a blow to this. We don't know if this is true, but he's allegedly felled his opponent with one single blow to the helmet or head with his battle axe. This is exactly the sort of axe that would have been in use at that time in the early 14th century, and indeed for the latter part of the 13th century and through most of the 14th century. Cheers for watching. I might have some more to say about this axe and these types of axes coming up soon. So stay watching the channel. Give us a like and a subscribe if you haven't done already. I'll put the link to Thor's Forge, to Tord's Facebook page below, where if you want to commission something like this or some other kind of axe or some other weapon you have in mind, where you can get in contact with him. Thanks for watching. See you soon. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.